Hello and welcome to the new episode of the All Walks of Life podcast. In today's episode, I sat down with Yogesh Maurya. Yogesh sir is the sporting editor at Fateh Hyderabad. In this episode, we spoke about topics such as youth development and how he sees youth development, which is totally different to the way I perceived it before this conversation. And it was a real eye-opener in the way of the practical things that are actually happening on the ground in some of the states in our country. Some of the other topics we delved at were some benefits franchise-based systems may have in sport. However, in the long term, it doesn't really hold a certain significance because of aspects such as youth development, which aren't being able to be brought out. And this was two different aspects when we were looking at, let's say, the NBA and comparing it to the ISL, where he pointed out that doesn't really hold because the NBA is played over a longest duration of time, whereas the ISL simply isn't. So the other topics we looked at were how physical education plays a part in a child's development and how physical education is being brought about in schools in India, and what in essence is physical education and how much of an emphasis it actually plays in our lives. Through understanding physical education, it was also pointed out that it isn't that when you focus on physical education you lose out on academics. It's rather the reverse. When you focus on physical education, you actually gain on in your academic front. And Yogesh sir spoke about how he was an example of this himself, studying in the US. He indulged in studies as well, but participated in playing soccer, as it's called there, and got into some Ivy League colleges, yet pursued playing football. So these were just some really good points to consider, and I hope that when you're listening to the conversation, you'll have a good listen. So just before we start the episode, do consider subscribing to the YouTube channel and just sending your love our way, because we really appreciate anything that's coming our way. And yeah, here's the episode. Hi Yogesh, welcome to the All Walks of Life podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on, sir.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
How have you been keeping yourself busy during the quarantine period then?
I haven't had a shortage of challenges when it comes to keeping busy. I'm always busy, and besides work, I have a 6-month-old son, so
Right, yeah.
for me, not too much has really changed, other than not meeting people as much as I'd like to, and not necessarily getting out as much as I'd like to. It's pretty much the same.
Right. I mean, so this is more about your career. So the reason I'm really interested to speak to you is because I see myself quite in the light you are currently. I see myself as a sporting director, or hopefully in the future, that's where I'd aspire to be, at an Indian club or a club abroad. But just for the viewers, maybe could you define the role of a sporting director? Because it's often thrown about in the media, but no one really understands the definition of what entails in the job of a sporting director.
Well, I think
So if you
that's
could just play,
because,
take
yeah,
a
it's a
lead
good
on that.
question. It's a good question, Ishan. That's because the job is different depending on the football club, and there is no exact definition of the role. But I would look at it. First of all, let's just look at why is it different. Every club has a different set of circumstances, whether it's their financing, whether it's where they are in terms of their evolution and history, whether it's the philosophy that the ownership would like to see on and off the pitch, whether it's the level of competition they're currently at. All of those things make the job, the nature of that particular job, very different. But the way I look at the position is it's sort of a blend of a technical position and a business position. So quite often you're involved in multiple things: identification of talent and recruitment of players, your player development, and you may be involved commercially. How are you going to monetize those players, whether it's an internal monetization or it's a sale? And then the other aspects of commercialization often can come under a sporting director in the same way some places may not have a CEO. They may just have a sporting director who's handling a lot of the commercial aspects. So match day revenue, sponsorship, merchandising, all of that could come under a sporting director job. So it really depends on the particular club as to what's in that role. But I would say it's likely not to be only technical, because then they're going to call it director of football or technical
Yeah.
director probably, right? So there's usually a commercial aspect to it.
No, that's very interesting that you touch upon that, because as you mentioned that it's totally different on how a particular club may decide to give us a particular job description to a sporting director or a technical director. Because let's say there have been different roles that have been put about, let's say head of football operations or a sporting director or a technical director, and what we as the general public, because there isn't a lot of education about that role, we perceive them to just handle everything at the club. So do you think that as a sporting director, as a CEO, there's often this sense that you have to take control into everything that's happening in the football club? I think Michael Zorc said that he's the sporting director at Dortmund. So he mentioned how he isn't just head of football operations, but looking at every single
It just depends
thing,
on
be
the executive
it medical, be it
structure.
sports science, be it training.
Yeah, sure. Because I'm sure from his perspective, and I don't know him personally, but I'm sure from his perspective, how those departments are run impacts his ability to develop players, recruit players that may have hidden value in them, and sell players if that's required. So I think one thing you'll understand is that departments in a football club largely cannot function in silos. Somebody has to be linking the communication and the decision making. Now, how many people are involved in that is different at every club. It depends on the culture and depends on what they think is necessary. I've seen a lot of club structures which, based on, I can only speak about India because this is my experiences. I think that I'm curious about what certain people do in those jobs, because I feel largely in the Indian context, you need people who can do multiple jobs just because of the nature of the financial ecosystem. And if you've got too many specialists, and I've spoken about this before, you're going to have a lot of people with time on their hands if they're not doing other things.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense, because when you speak about the whole financial side of things, because I was speaking to a grassroots coach and he mentioned how his role entails coaching everything, looking at the travel, be it coaching, be it accommodation, everything comes under his hands, because it's not financially possible for that grassroots club to have, let's say, a media manager or have, let's say, someone who's looking after
Well, yeah,
accommodation. So in
it's
that,
not even about financially possible, though. It's also what's smart. I mean, I do that. Our coaches have to do everything. Why shouldn't they? Any youth club, go to a smaller youth club. They don't have all these positions. I mean, what is that travel manager doing anyway? Half the time the team's not even traveling. So that person's going to have to do something else too. Even if you've hired that position. Otherwise, I'm someone who is, this is just because of my particular ecosystem. I'm fanatical about cost control and making sure you're not wasting time and money on resources that may not be required. That's what's more important than whether you can afford it or not. The question is it worth it?
Right. No, something you touched upon in the role of a sporting director and how generally clubs would like to run themselves is they have this overarching culture that they want to put out, or let's say a philosophy. So do you actually believe that there is something called, let's say, a philosophy that a club embodies, or is just something that, let's say, we as fans or we as the media just put it out there so that people associate some kind of romantic aspect to football? Do you think there's something called as a philosophy for
Yeah,
a
I
football
do.
club?
Of course I do. I believe in that, but you don't see it as often because there's so much change, right? I don't know what the latest numbers are from the League Managers Association in England, but I think the average manager is now less than 5 months or 6 months now in the job. So yeah, you can keep trying to recruit people who have a similar philosophy, but the more you change individuals, the more things change. You could look at an example where someone's successful, not necessarily having an exact philosophy, is obviously Chelsea Football Club. They've
Mm.
turned over managers and changed playing philosophies fairly often and still been very victorious. So it doesn't mean that having a philosophy makes you right. It's a question of what results you get and how committed you are to it. And of course, the most famous and the one that's most admired and probably rightfully so, of course, is what everything Barcelona has achieved. But even they recruit outside players and spend a lot of money on them. And if you look now at coaching, you can see how they've really struggled to kind of find that coaching pipeline since Pep Guardiola. They've really struggled. They've had to go outside to recruit. And they've had, arguably for them, I guess you could say, a mixture of results. So, yes, a philosophy is important because it defines how you're going to take decisions, really, ultimately, on and off the pitch. What are the values of the club? If you are committed to a certain type of play, can you implement that play from your academy all the way up to your first team? Or is there going to be a difference between both? That doesn't sound like a great idea, right? You'd want a consistent idea being taught from a very young age all the way to the first team. And when I say consistent idea, I don't just mean whether it's a high possession philosophy or a counter-pressing philosophy. I also mean the values. What are the sporting values that you believe your players and coaches should believe in and espouse and teach to others? So I do believe in it. But the other issue, if you look at an Indian context of philosophy, remember something. Our competitions are largely seasonal, and we don't have a financial ecosystem that is very friendly to the idea of being long-term invested. So if you're committing to one way, remember, like imagine you're in the Youth I League today and you only have 5 or 6 games in a year. Well, what's your philosophy and what are your people doing the rest of the year? That takes a little bit of thought. How are you going to figure that out? Otherwise, you're going to get discontinuity. So there's a good reason why a lot of places don't necessarily have an identifiable philosophy. The ecosystem doesn't exactly help you to do that. It takes a lot of thinking and a big financial commitment.
I do agree with like the thoughts you put out there, that the fact that even if you have a philosophy, until and unless you don't put it into practice, that if it's a youth team and they aren't playing, let's say 30 games a season or 25 games a season, then it becomes redundant after a point, because if you are just playing, as you mentioned, 5 games a season, then it isn't as strong found, if I may put it that way. And this is kind of why I want to link it back to Fateh Hyderabad and ask you, what was, let's say, the primary reasons of, let's say, dropping out of the second division of
But
the
hang on. Let's go back for a sec. I want to make sure you've understood my point.
Okay.
I'm not saying anybody's wrong for only playing 5 games. They may not be able to afford to play more.
Right.
The ecosystem doesn't say, hey, play the Youth I League and then come play our local league, which is going to give you 25 games at a very affordable, friendly cost. So it's not that just because someone doesn't have a philosophy that's visible, it's because they've decided not to.
Right.
It's not like we have all these people playing 30 and 40 games and not having a philosophy. They're not playing 30 and 40 games because it's not, that opportunity isn't there. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So having a philosophy to me is second piece of it. First, you need to have the games.
Right.
Okay. So now, your question on Fateh Hyderabad.
Do you think that? Yeah. Okay. Go on. Yeah.
You had a question about linking it back
Oh,
to
right.
Fateh
Yeah. So
Hyderabad.
yeah, it was about, let's say, your decision of dropping out of, let's say, the second the I League. Were you unsure about where it was heading in terms of the structure of, let's say, Indian football, or what were your decisions behind that?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like
Yeah.
I took it overnight. I've been saying it for 2 years that I'm really concerned that I'm spending more money and getting less games. And the format keeps changing. And look, I think sometimes it's smart as a person, whether it's the business part or the learning of your craft, to just take a break and observe and really establish more perspective. And, let's not kid ourselves. The ISL tried to wipe out the I League in the second division. I mean, that was the clear intention. I never got upset about it, right? Because I always looked at it as it's a business tactic, and it's a tactic that's worked in India. Monopolization. It's still in effect in a lot of sectors. Big players can dominate through what other people would consider unfair means. Now, the issue when it comes to sport is we have, I do think the vast majority of people romanticize about meritocracy. And sport gives democratization. It gives at least the idea to somebody that there is a place where that meritocracy is still somewhat protected. So, under those conditions, I need to understand what I'm dealing with before I keep throwing money at it, right? And I did. I still continue to invest. But I think it got to a point where you're forcibly relegating a team who's done well. Fine, I can't really fight that because, I mean, we really didn't have much say. But I can take some time and understand what it means for the future and how I may try and have our club compete under these circumstances and achieve its objectives. And I mean, a lot of people, I've spoken to Ranjit many times. People know a lot of people dislike Ranjit, but he's the one who got this done, that there's even some roadmap. Now, whether they follow it and implement it, we'll find out.
Yeah.
Because as you can see, the financial world is highly volatile right now. And, the excuses are going to be, there's always excuses available not to follow something. I've seen this in other industries too, not just sport. We got problems. We can't follow this timeline. We got to change it. So, I think if you're a little cautious like I am, and I've already invested and put my hard-earned time and money into this, I think I've earned the right to just wait and watch a little bit.
No, that's certainly interesting, and this draws upon, let's say, some of the bigger questions about football ownership. It's not just in India, just on a global scale as a whole. When we look at football ownership, I've spoken to a couple of owners, and they've generally spoken to me how it's generally seen as a side hobby, something you do out of passion because you really love the sport, and you've always had this childhood dream of owning a football club or being a part of a football club. Do you think that comes down to it, and football isn't just an aspect of you trying to even break even or even make profits out of it? Do you think on a business on a business level, do you think that football can actually repay you in terms of profits or being even break even?
See, that's again, I would say that's a overly simplistic way of looking at it, right? The first thing is this. If you drop below the Premier League, teams, even in the Premier League, you can imagine with that kind of revenue, there are teams losing money, which to me, if I was running those teams, I'm sorry to say this to those people, if you're in the Premier League and you're losing money, you don't know what you're doing. It's absolutely ridiculous that you should lose money in the Premier League and lose, even there should be even a doubt of you staying up under those conditions. So that's the first part. The second thing that I'm going to say is if you drop down into the championship, there's a lot of teams that lose money. So this isn't something that's just like only in India and in certain developing countries, right? Teams lose money. Yeah. So to that point, obviously, if the industry is telling you that you can't make this your main source of revenue as an owner, then it doesn't become your primary core business. But to go back to my first point, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be evaluating it to some level as a business, right? So if your objective is to create value with every rupee or dollar you're investing, then to me, I've been successful in other businesses. I still don't want to waste my money, what I'm calling waste. I still want to get the most value for my investment. Now that might mean, yeah, I'm going to lose money developing players because player development costs more money than acquiring free agents, which I've
Yeah.
said before. But I believe in youth development. I want to give a sporting outlet to youth. Maybe we can develop these players. Maybe they'll have financial value in the future. It's at this point it's unpredictable, and it's unpredictable even in the markets where there are multi-million, pound transactions. It's still unpredictable. It's a highly risky business developing players. But even in a market like India, maybe you want to give back. You have a passion for the sport, like I said. But if you look at the pro level, my only viewing as someone who's of course we're all fans of the game, but as someone who's a coach, who's a business person with a lot of experience in different businesses, what I look at in the sport in India today is what are you getting for what you're investing at the top ladder of the game?
Yeah.
And what could the return be? If you're saying I don't care about that money, fine, but what would the return be if you invested it in player development? And I don't believe that the majority of rupees going in are being wisely invested. That's just that's from that's not coming from someone who just views this as a side hobby and a passion. I've put my life into the game, and it means that you need to use a different measuring stick, and all the stuff that made you money in those other businesses, start taking a little bit of it, maybe not all of it, and putting it into this, and you're going to see, I think more people will see eventually what I'm saying is true.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a really big passion of mine, of like, let's say, eventually if I do work for a football club, building it very sustainably, like you mentioned, that taking a very, how it's called in the West, and it's often just bantered in the media, let's say a Moneyball approach of spending each dollar or each pound really effectively and to its best measure. So can you draw upon some examples maybe of how, let's say, a club can better run itself, or have, let's say, a philosophy that will eventually, in the years to come, as you mentioned, through player development, will eventually pay them back in rupees?
I don't have I have some ideas, but right now, if you look at the costs and you look at the owners, these are industrialists, very wealthy owners who can subsidize the losses.
Yep.
So the first point I'm making to everyone is we've increased the costs and decreased the number of games, both pro level and youth level. We've increased the cost. Now, what would any person who considers themselves some type of knowledgeable, experienced person in their industry would think that that's a good principle? That's a really bad principle to begin with, when your objective is to develop better players, right? For India to compete against better Asian nations, you have to develop the players. So that's the first core principle, which I think is wrong. The objective should be, can we lower the costs and increase the number of games? That should be the number one objective. Then comes everything else. And how can you do it sustainably? I mean, there's different ideas. Pay to play can only go so far. Because, again, scaling pay to play and reaching the number of kids you may want to reach and need to reach is going to be very difficult. So that's only one part of the answer. Right? So maybe the answer is to become very hyper local and do things that are affordable, that don't cost a lot of money and aren't necessary. I mean, and you have to remember, in today's day and age, there's a lot of liability considerations. When I grew up playing youth, I mean, our parents paid what was never very expensive in the United States. Today, it's really expensive in America to participate in elite football. It was never very expensive. It was so affordable. It was to the point where when there was somebody from a really underprivileged background, the other parents were able to chip in and pay for that child to be on the team. And everything was largely voluntary. Our parents coached the teams on a voluntary basis. Schools provided us pitches free of cost as a service to the community, because most of us kids were going to those schools, which were public schools. Okay, so you had pitches on a volunteer basis. Every kid brought his own ball. I mean, if he had an expense, it was his ball and his shoes. Okay, we didn't have a physio. There's no concept of it. You got hurt and you either toughed it out, you walked it off, you put some ice on. If it was really bad, your parent had to take you to a doctor to get treated. But there was no concept of physio. There was no concept of a team manager. The manager was one of the dads or moms of the team. There was no. All these things are requirements. There was no technical director. And most of the coaches didn't even have coaching licenses. They're volunteers who learn through experience. A lot of my coaches were immigrants from other countries. Who were from the immigrant community and immigrant exposure. My first coaches were Colombian and Italian, and they brought that from their country. So, what I'm saying is we're accelerating the cost, but we're not necessarily on a larger scale improving development. That's just my view.
Do you think, because I've seen this for myself in the UK, because I'm at university there, and I really see this drive that let's say I speak to my batchmates and they speak about how their dads or some of their uncles actually go out on, let's say, on a Sunday, as it's mentioned, Sunday league coaching, and they coach, let's say, 8-year-olds or 7-year-olds, and that's just seen on like a societal level. Do you think that is missing in India, that drive towards, let's say, even parents in, let's say,
there's lots of coaches who coach and don't get any recognition or credit in our communities. The thing is, they're not being plastered all over the media because they don't have the facilities to spend on. They don't have huge budgets, and they don't charge the kids. It's a community-driven thing. This has existed way before the I League and the ISL. It is there. It's just that we've gone the direction of looking at it, I think we've gone the direction of trying to commercialize the sport before it's really, it's such an immature time. So those results are going to be really inconsistent. It's not like we don't have community coaches. We've got, I'm sure we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in multiple sports. So that's, whoever says that, they don't know what they're talking about.
I mean, that's possibly true, because even though observed it from,
it's not possibly, there's people coaching. Hang on, it's not possibly. There are people coaching on a volunteer basis who are parents in communities all across this country. Anyone who says that's not happening doesn't know what they're talking about.
Well, I haven't seen
the majority of professional players in Indian football today have never paid a dime to be coached. So who are these people who are saying this? They don't know what they're talking about.
Well, also, let's touch upon this aspect that, let's say, there are certain pockets in India who develop more talent than, let's say, some other pockets.
And just
at a younger age. Is that one of the more underlying factors?
Pardon? There's pockets that produce more talent than others. It goes back to your first question. Guess what? The pockets that are producing the best players don't have licensed coaches in there. So who are these people who are saying that coaches don't volunteer? Let's go up into the Northeast. Let's go into Kerala. Let's go. I'll show you coaches who are volunteers giving their time where all this talent is coming out of, and these kids are playing every day. That's the real secret. The kids are playing every day from a young age. Every day.
And that's what it comes down to, like, isn't it? Because of the time they're spending on, let's say, the football pitch, is how they're able to hone their skills. It doesn't matter
that's the first
what kind
part.
of coach there is.
No, again, to simplify, the first part, you see, it's like anything. You can't just say one part is the answer. And we're always looking for these simplistic answers. But we can say that the biggest weight, if you have a formula, the biggest weightage in that formula is going to be the age they start and how many minutes they're playing every day. And when I say playing games. That's going to have the biggest weight. Then the question becomes, okay, when they're at a formation age, let's say above the age of 12, and the route to being a professional player, how can we improve that? Because that, I do believe, coach intervention has a lot to do with it. Because if you look at a lot of the professional players who come through that I've worked with in second division, at least, a lot of things that I've had to coach and teach in other countries because of the academy systems in the formation age, again, I'm talking above the age of 12 up to the age of, let's say, 17, 18, would have already been taught. So you get a lot of raw players at second division level, maybe even into the I League, who are really raw technical and physical specimens, but their maturity tactically is really underdeveloped for their age. So I think if you now looking at the formula, right, there's two pieces to it that should have the most weight. The first is, and this has been expressed by many coaches throughout the country, and I've had all of them on who have, Richard Hood, Pradyum Reddy, Floyd Pinto. I mean, I've had the top coaches on. Savio Madera, who is a great mentor of mine, he agrees with me too. The younger they are, they need to be playing in these small-sided games. Hence, they had this concept of the baby league, which Richard conceived of and made a platform. And as they get into the academy age, we need to, improve the coaching intervention while continuing the competitive games. That's the as simplistic a way I can put the formula to you.
Right. Something I've been studying at university, and it's this aspect of, let's say, biobanding. So it's about how every child develops at a different rate. So some of the clubs have actually initiated this in their practice. So it doesn't matter if you're an 11-year-old, but you're biologically already an early maturer, say 13 or 14, then you'll be put together with the 13-year-olds and the 14-year-olds. Do you think that's a concept that can be initiated in India to make a more fair playing side? Or do you think it's better that we go through chronological age and have the 11-year-olds?
Well, let's break this down. Let's break this down. The biobanding, of course, the research being done is showing that, the number of late bloomers is a lot higher than people actually understand. And so let's take it in pieces. First of all, we have this issue where people lie about the chronological age.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, that's caused the federation, and I understand why, to implement this TW3 test or whatever it is, which, what I've checked with medical experts around the world, and they say there's absolutely no age test that is 100% accurate. But they've had to put this in, and it's caused us to become now overly cautious. So you've got really younger kids participating. So now maybe your biobanding is based on some accuracy versus chronological age. You understand what I'm saying? If you're biobanding based on false chronological ages, then it's just creating more of a mishmash.
Yeah.
It's important. How important is it? Look, the first step is to get the right kids chronologically on the field so we know what we're talking about. Then we can analyze the biobanding. But like I said, as important as that is, let's go again to a general concept. These kids who were, if let's say the majority of the coaching industry agrees that the first step is getting the kids to play more small-sided games at a younger age, I think that world over is almost accepted. The next step is, okay, what is good for their development? And, playing multiple sports is good for their development, right? Playing, possibly allowing a kid to play up a year, to go back to your biobanding, or even up 2 years, we know can actually be good for their development, potentially, right? If they have the ability to cope with their technical and physical skills. Maybe they're not as big as someone they're playing up with. They may not be as fast, but they can cope. If, for example, in the sport of football, because they're able to hold the ball, they're able to make decisions with the ball, even though they're playing up in age, right? And we know that that can accelerate development, right? So the point is, there is a real big movement out there about early specialization, the Tiger model being questionable, that it's not great for every kid because the drop-off rate is really high to a pro contract. It's a steep ladder, but you're developing a lot of good athletes who don't know whether they could make it in another sport, right? So you got this pool of athletes who are only playing football from a really young age, but the vast majority are not going to make it to a professional contract.
Yeah.
And what happens to them? It means, oh, I can't play football, so I can't do any other sport potentially professionally. And that's another weakness in the model that is generally being followed. So, and your biobanding lies in that because it's a similar point for a different reason, is that don't specialize in group too early. Let them play multiple sports. Try and delay that specialization as long as possible. Because I'm sure there's a lot of I see a lot of really good athletes come and try out for second division. They're often not really good enough to hold a place in professional football, but they're good athletes. And when I ask, do they play other sports? Often it's like, no, sorry, I played cricket for fun, but nothing really else. And I think that's a potential loss.
Right. No, I mean, I guess looking at the biobanding aspect of how you mentioned that, let's say it's better for a child to play a year group above or even two year groups above if they are able to, let's say, compete in that environment. Well, there are two aspects to this. So obviously, yes, I've seen on a first-hand experience that does play tremendous efforts in improving that particular child. But then again, the aspect of biobanding is because, let's say, some of the more smaller people who haven't, let's say, grown as much in height as of yet.
That's a different. I'm not addressing. Obviously, that's what biobanding is. You don't want the older, taller kid to just dominate everything. I'm making a different point.
Yeah. No.
So you can move. Maybe you move that kid out, or you move a kid down or up, or you group together these kids who have similar skills. I get it.
Yeah. No,
but
I mean,
it's not as important a point in Indian context right now. Well, it is important first to get the chronological age right, to me. And then we can worry about the biobanding after we know that the date on the certificate is the actual date.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you touched upon how there isn't, let's say, worldwide a way to find out the real chronological age that the professional footballers put out. Do you think there is a way that we can actually tackle this? I mean, I've mentioned biobanding as
I don't believe there's any great way because it depends on the value of the society. Right now, we still continue to reward kids without really much accountability. I know there was the case with the boy at Jamshedpur, and I've seen cases where kids have got, the federation. I mean, they take a lot of criticism, but they're doing the best they can on this issue. I've seen kids come with two different certificates and they think they're not going to get caught. At least with the online system, now what's happening is kids come to us with a certain birth certificate. We upload it. 2 years later, they're trying out for Santosh Trophy, and they've uploaded a different birth certificate. And the federation is saying, hey, you guys, what's this? And I say, hey, if he's gone and given a different one there, I had nothing to do with it. Probably both of them are inaccurate, but, I'm not a court that can verify documents. So the only way to really address it is you have to take harsh measures like they're taking. So I don't have a problem with it, what they're doing. I get why they're doing it. And the second thing is the society's values have to move their needle to a point where they won't do it. And, the only way when I see these extremes, you have to have I would have preferred harsh penalties if we were able to prove it. But the problem is you can't prove it.
Yeah.
No matter what, even if you're suspecting it and it's so obvious. I mean, there have been years where it's very obvious that, kids playing, for example, under 15 or, I saw under 18 where kids clearly in their 20s playing in the under 18. Okay. But you couldn't really prove it because there's no test. So now how can you impose a harsh penalty? Because that person could legally fight you and win based on the law, maybe not morally, right? So if there is a way to prove it, my suggestion would be we don't need this test, but we need really harsh penalty. So people just don't do it. But we don't have that. So we have this sort of in-between solution right now, and you just have to learn to live with it and cope.
The aspect of, let's say, you touched upon how there has to be a societal shift of there isn't as much acceptance of, let's say, age fraud. But do you think that can be initiated by, let's say, the Indian clubs? So when these players actually come up with multiple birth certificates, they say that, no, this is totally wrong, we will not accept you. Or they'll have much harsher, let's say,
like I told
policies
you,
of...
I mean, I think this is a generational gap too. All these people, I tell my players, you guys think you have to be nice to everyone. It doesn't work. You got to be honest about what is going to get you the results you want with people.
Yeah.
And this being nice to people, it's one of the stupidest things I've ever seen that's, developed in the mindsets of a lot of people. Look, I say clearly, I get a lot of people who come in and want to work with me, and they're just always nice to people. And I'm like, what? You think you're going to get what you need by being nice right now? It's not how it works. So you got to hold people accountable. So to your point, here's the thing: the clubs, relying on the clubs to, implement this is you're basically saying, well, all people are wonderful and they'll change. Why? What is their incentive? So the federation put this test in because they're smart. They know they need to impose this. The clubs aren't going to do it. Their incentive largely has been to get away with it. We know that.
Yeah.
So no, I don't think the clubs are going to do that. And the federation, with the online requirements, now you have to upload the documents before you can officially sign the player, and you have to pay the whatever transfer fees are required before the player is officially signed to you. So I think they're doing a better job of catching it. And no, I don't think you can expect the clubs to do it. We've had situations where I can say, because that's how I am as a person, but I don't expect that from everyone. I banned more than 3 players a week before under 18 tournament. We came to know there was a difference between the birth certificate they gave us and the Aadhaar card, which the federation didn't even ask for. We caught it. And I said, no, they can't go. And our team dropped all the games. And these were 3 starters. But I don't expect other teams to do that and other owners to do that. That's not practical. Why would they?
But why isn't it, like, just from an ideological standpoint, why wouldn't you want to, let's say, better, if you have more youth players coming through, wouldn't that be better for the nation?
Of course, but that, again, this I don't believe you can get. Of course, because we're diluting the player pool by allowing these overage kids to play in age groups where they're not adding any value, and
Yeah.
But first of all, for people to try and understand that concept is very hard. It's very abstract to them. Second thing is, again, like I said, I mean, you're trying to change a culture, and that takes decades and years. And I believe the only way to do it is if we can get to, if the medical world has some 100% test that I don't know about, then impose a harsh measure.
Yeah.
Then the culture will develop eventually where people say, hey, man, it's not worth it. And by the way, our results have gotten better. But to expect people to do it because of their value system, their personal value system, that to me is naive.
Right. Well, yeah, I guess you can look at it in that way. I mean, I know you
Pardon?
spent time.
Guess what? It's not guess. It is what it is. Who's implementing it without the forced rule? I mean, Ishan, you're saying I'm guessing. The federation has put the rule in because they pleaded with people for years not to do this, and they did it anyway. So it's not a guess. This is based on my real experience.
No, I understand that.
So what is a guess?
But then I'm saying that if you're saying that, let's say the federation has implemented it, then why shouldn't the clubs do it as well?
But they are. They're following it, and if they get caught, there's serious consequences. You're losing players, and if you got too many players, you're not allowed to participate. I mean, you can't just expect people to all of a sudden become idealists. That's just, it's a waste of time and energy. You know, it's like
Well, that,
if based on what you're saying, we wouldn't need law enforcement and police officers. It's a policy. I mean, I don't understand. What is, I guess?
no, it's a gradual step though, isn't it?
What's a gradual step?
Let's say, I worked at East Bengal and I've seen this firsthand there, that there is, let's say, an aspect of age fraud in these clubs. So if they do start implementing it, then let's say the other clubs will come to say that, okay, the measures that we are taking, it's they are
But why? But what are you? I don't understand. The clubs themselves don't even know the actual age. The kids come with false documents all the time.
No, but
So
sometimes
you're also just assuming that the clubs know. They don't always know. They can guess.
no,
right?
Yogesh, I've actually seen this firsthand, that sometimes they demand for second.
Yeah, of course. There's people like that, but there's people like that in every industry. This is why I'm saying this is so naive. I mean, you could pick any other industry besides sports. You're going to find people who are committing fraud because it's in their short-term incentive. And it's unlikely they're going to get caught. That's why the Federation has put this policy out. You're not going to get change based on idealism. That is really, really naive. If this country has taught us anything, it's that, for sure. Right? I mean, just look at the amount of fraud being committed in banks. The government has had to come in and bail out. You know, the latest one, I think, was Yes Bank. I mean, how many frauds do we need to occur for people to why do we think that, you know, the sports ecosystem is different people than all the other people in the country? They're still the same people operating largely in a similar culture. So people are going to do what they think they can. They're going to push the envelope as far as they can.
Yeah. Okay, so the other question I wanted to point towards you was, let's say, you work in the American system as well, and you've observed it close. And what let's say less to the ISL. I know it's probably very difficult to compare both these entities, but let's say we've seen a lot of player development that's actually happening in the MLS, and there are actually a lot of praises that are being put towards the MLS and even the A League in Australia. So do you think that a franchise-based system can actually help towards player development? Or
well, that's also an opinion, Ishan. Hang on. That's also an opinion. I've read so much criticism of the A League player development pathway. I mean, there's so much criticism of where Australia is today and where they were before the A League and how successful they were. And there's a lot of discussion about how do we produce players like we did in that golden era. So that's an assumption. As far as the MLS, yeah, I mean, I just had on one of my, you know, my close friends and colleagues, a teammate from college, from FC Dallas, on my podcast, and he's been heavily involved. But again, and they're the #1 academy in the MLS. But again, you know, how much of this is the attention that we're giving it today in the overall sport versus the attention we didn't give it 15 years ago? Because if you look at national team level, the results haven't been as good in the U.S. So that's also debated. Can a franchise league succeed? Sure. Why wouldn't it? Why can't it? But the question isn't, can it succeed? The question is it what's right for the country?
Yeah.
Is it what's right for the sport? Is it what's right? You know, we're talking about financial sustainability, and we basically, if you're not, you know, close to being a multi-billionaire, you can't participate in the pro league. That's not a great concept in a country like India. To me, I have nothing against people who have decided to invest some of their wealth in this. I think it's great that they're supporting the sport. I am against the idea that because I won't pay a franchise fee, I can participate by winning through the ladder. Yeah. What are you so afraid of? I mean, you can't say that 10 teams speak for 1.5 billion people. That's really naive now, right? There's football going on all over this country. It just doesn't have an outlet. Okay, I mean, there's kids playing in all kinds of districts and villages who, you know, and coaches and people supporting them who we're not going to know about. So the question, like I said, again, and to simplify what I'm saying, first of all, the I League was never financially solvent either. And even today, it's not. There were always ups and downs with clubs and financing, right? So it's not like it's the perfect model either. It's not. It's the ecosystem that we're in. It's the maturity level of the sport. It's an immature sport still. So the ISL, there's teams that have had issues, right? It's been public. It happens. And I, as an owner, I would understand that. I don't have a problem with an owner saying, hey, man, I can't afford to do this now, or I don't want to. I don't want to prioritize this expense. Teams have traded hands. There's teams who owe coaches and players money, and maybe in some cases it's legitimate. Maybe in some cases it's just, hey, man, I don't have the cash flow, or I don't want to pay this right now. But the point is, just because of the ISL, we haven't solved financial solvency issues. It's still volatile, right? So what are we saying about the franchise league is making it successful? I mean, I think it's a great product. It's brought a great attention to the sport. It's marketed well. I know all my players want to play in it, right? It's on TV. It's got coverage. The pitches are nice and green. You know, the travel arrangements are better than what they have to do at my level. So I get that, and I always encourage my players to root for to go for their goal, and we try and help them achieve that. But if you're telling me the franchise system is better, it actually hasn't proven that. It has actually proven that it can spend even more money and not necessarily end up with a better player. Right? That's what actually it's showing me. Right. And that's something harsh that I'm saying, but let's do the math. Do the math. So I don't know why we should persist with that model. I just, you know, it's like copying everything that's American is also not like, I don't think just taking someone else's model that's successful for a certain reason in America applies to the same circumstances here in India.
No, see, like I understand that from a player development standpoint, but let's say when you're looking at franchise teams, let's say when you're looking at the IPL, when you're looking at the NBA, I understand that there's a very small pool of, let's say, team owners who are actually making the most out of the coverage that they're getting, the commercialization that they're getting. But through that,
sorry, say that again. Can you repeat that?
Let's say, okay, when you look at the MLS, when you look at the NBA, the IPL, when you look at these kind of franchise-based competitions, there's a very small pool of team owners who are actually the most out of the commercial.
Hang on. Don't bring the NBA. The NBA is the most, after the NFL, I think it's the most commercially successful league in the world. Okay, so if it's not, it's... So the idea that the NBA doesn't exploit its revenue, I mean, now you're watching The Last Dance now. You can see how the NBA is globally skyrocketed in popularity.
Yeah,
so
but
that's not comparable to the IPL. The IPL is, you know, is it even 2 months? It's great financial success because cricket, a mature sport in India. They won the World Cup in the sport. It has become the national sport. It has a lot of maturity, and we produce some of the best cricket players in the world consistently. So that's a completely different set of, and America, you know, yeah, I know a lot of European, South American countries are producing great basketball players, but you know, America's still producing great basketball players, best in the world. India is not producing the best football players in the world. So the context is a little bit different, right? And it's not that teams in the NBA aren't exploiting their financial opportunity or player development. MLS people are investing in player development. They're doing their best. And a lot of teams in the MLSL are breaking even and making a profit now. Some are still losing money. But again, it's the United States of America. You're talking about a much higher per capita income, a country where parents are willing to pay for participation in sport. So I don't know if that, again, is a comparable basis to a franchise league in India.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, but in the sense that, let's say, when you're actually associating yourself, let's say, as a fan, then it's much easier when you're taking into consideration. I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying when I look at it on a global scale, and that's why maybe the introduction of the European Super League has been bandied about. Because when you look at the Champions League pot and how
Introduction, sorry. When
of
you
a Europe
look at what
of a
at a
Euro,
global scale?
of a European Super League. And when you look at, let's say, the Champions League winners, it's generally been very more East European than West European. So there sort of does already exist a divide, let's say, in terms of the money that, let's say, the top your Premier League clubs have, or the top German club have, versus, let's say, a club in Serbia. So it's almost inevitable that eventually we will reach, let's say, a franchise-based system in football as well. So that was my general thought process when I was looking at it on a franchise
But
basis.
but but that uh, yeah, I mean, it's if you look, see, you have to make a distinction between wealth and investing in football and franchise ownership, right? These football clubs that wealthy owners are investing in are historic in their communities. And investing is not bad. Football clubs need money, right? I view it as a good thing, but it all depends on the context. If you're investing in England or the Bundesliga, you can legitimately make a business plan that says I'm going to rise through the ranks and get more TV revenue, more match day revenue, and more player sale revenue. That's a legitimate business plan because it exists today. If your model is burn, burn, burn with a guess as to what the day might be that the TV and match day merchandise and player revenue is able to cover your cost, then I'm questioning the nature of that construct right now. Because right now it's a guess, right? So it's demanding significant resources. So I just don't think that when you actually look at the practical numbers even and leave the emotion out of it, it makes sense to me. What did make sense to me though, and which I've also said before, is the ISL in the short format like the IPL made a lot of sense to me. Okay, it was 2 months. It was a hit. It had a lot of attention, and the fan loves that in India, right? Short form duration tournament, but it's not how our sport is structured by FIFA. You're comparing the NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, NHL, MLS. These are seasons that are going, 9, 10 months a year, not 2 months. That in itself should tell you what the differences in consumption are, right? The consumption has gone down since they've expanded the season.
So this was a question on, let's say, a multi-sport variant in our country. Let's say we already have such a popular sport in cricket. Do you think eventually, I'm not saying it will happen in 5 years, 10 years, maybe not in my lifetime. Do you think football will ever it's even possible that football can do so when there is a sport as big as cricket in our country that will always have to take second place?
Of course, other sports are growing, but the thing is, everybody thinks cricket was an overnight success.
No. No.
It wasn't. It took decades and decades. Why do we expect that football is going to accelerate the growth all of a sudden?
Yeah.
It's misguided, is my view, and on practical experience. Okay, and now you have a lot of competing stuff for consumption, right? Netflix and all this other content, and there's
Yeah.
obviously socially people can afford to go out to eat and have a good time. So there's a lot of competition for that social time in the developing world. So, I think my only point is, of course, I believe the sport is going to grow, just like anything's growing in the developing world. I just think we've put unrealistic timelines, because just because you invest more money up front to try and accelerate growth doesn't mean it's going to work.
But do you think eventually, let's say there's this one day in, let's say, 100 years time, or even 75 years time, that football will better cricket, let's say, in terms of consumption of the
I don't
sport
even know
around
if
the
it's 100.
country?
First of all, whether it's 20 years, 30 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 100 years, no one really knows. But of course, there is a huge generation of youth that follow football ardently, and it's not. I haven't at least seen to the exclusion of cricket. They follow both now more fully than perhaps earlier. They were more fully invested in cricket. Now it's kind of becoming divided. Right, they still enjoy the IPL. Most of the youth that I've met, and they're following other sports too. Stuff takes time. I just feel that it's irrelevant. If you look at the sport the way I do, it's irrelevant how long it takes, because I'm more interested in how do we develop the players, and it really doesn't matter when you look at it that way. Now, if you have wealth resources to burn and you're passionate and you can keep supporting at the top of the game, it doesn't mean that you can't be successful. Look at Bangalore, a superb football club who's devoted their resources. Of course, everyone doesn't have those types of resources that the Jindals do, but it doesn't mean they did it and they lost money. But guess what? A lot of other teams are doing it and they're losing, and they're not really developing talent. These guys have done it. They're growing it, and they're making talent, and they're winning. So there is something to that formula. I just say it shouldn't be to the exclusion. I mean, I think I read an interview, and I haven't spoken to them, but I think I read an interview of Paul Jindal where he more or less implied that they're spending a lot more money today and not necessarily getting better out of it than they got in the I-League. Yeah. Except that, because of the structure, now those seats have gone to the Champions League, have gone to the ISL. So he knows he can do what he's doing now on an I-League budget. That obviously is, again, another clue. It's another clue that maybe this is questionable. All of this is highly questionable.
I don't know when this actually will be implemented in, let's say, Indian football. Is, let's say, the development of data science and let's say how data science is used effectively in staff recruitment and player recruitment, and even eventually running your club. I mean, I'm a big fan of Billy Beane, and he's spoken a lot about the implementation of artificial intelligence in sports and how he's used that for recruitment. Do you think, let's say, how long will it take for Indian clubs to adopt data science or these
look, I'm, as a graduate of a premier business school that emphasizes quantitative analysis, I have always been very, very supportive of and a believer in using data to analyze your decisions, whether it's a financial decision or a sporting decision, whatever it is. And the two are related, obviously. But again, you're talking about a very elite group of people in our sport. It's a very small number of people who really need to who can move their margin even by engaging in it. My first priority is get more kids playing from a younger age and playing every day. That's the first priority before you're trying to extract that marginal gain and improve decision making. But yes, data science is going to grow. It's going to grow in India too. There was a time period. There's still a lot of people who don't do any video analysis. That has to come in. I think more prevalent in more prevalence. I think that's happening. And the other thing you have to remember with data science is, it's not easy. You have to be able to interpret the signal and ignore the noise. And when there's a lot more similarity in structure, the meaning of the data is obviously more valuable because the parameters and the control variables are similar. But when you have a lot of variance, because the ecosystem has so much variance in it, the meaning of that data that you apply, it requires a lot of experience to know when that data is something you should factor in and not factor in. So what's an example? Players not playing the same amount of games over the trajectory of their, let's say you take from age 8 to 18. Big difference in the number of games played for a lot of players. And then the question is, what were those games? Some kids are playing 11 aside at age 6, 7. Some kids were playing short-sided, right? So now you start to see the differences emerge right there. Whereas in a lot of developed countries, the structures are similar. The competitive structures are similar. So a lot of that data is a lot more meaningful, right? And that's where you have to, I feel, just be a little careful. Maybe, if you're in a pro team like the ISL or the I-League, at least there you could take a season. You could take 2 seasons, 3 seasons, and you start to get some comparability that's valuable because the data sets are similar in terms of the variables, right? So I think before it's really going to be totally valuable, there's some things that are obviously valuable, but you need a few seasons of consistent control variables.
Yeah. No, I mean that's true. That the fact that data science, it's going to take a long time for, let's say, even Indian clubs to maybe implement it on a large scale basis, where they make it a sense of them running a club through using data. And you mentioned,
but it's not.
the
But that's
emphasis
my
on,
point. It's not about a long time. It's first about the data has to be useful.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't about wanting to do it as much as, again, like I say, I mean, we're not understanding. Like if someone said every youth club is going to get 30 games in this format in this age group, now all of a sudden you have data that's useful.
Right.
Without that, what I'm trying to explain to you is it doesn't really matter. You can spend all your time on the data, or you can get the kids on the field and get them playing in the right format, which is going to get you more players, right?
Yeah, this brings us back to that whole
You got to get the
question of,
kids on
let's
the
say,
field
the
playing
structure.
more.
Yeah. This brings us back to the whole question of the structure in Indian football. If there is a streamlined structure that's followed in all states around the country, which eventually leads to, let's say, the I League and the ISL, then maybe you can even consider implementing data, because then you'll say that, okay, because every state team is playing a certain amount of games, then maybe you'll be able to implement it at a club-wide scale. But as you mentioned, if it's not possible, that there are, let's say, one state team playing 5 games and the other state team playing 25 games, then there isn't a lot of
Well, you
thing
can.
can draw from that.
Well, yeah, there are ways to use it, though. Maybe rather than employing a performance statistician, because you probably can't afford that, your coach can look at practice data and game data internally for their team and try and use data that's meaningful within what that coach is looking for.
Yeah.
Right? So that is a way to utilize that data. Just start first measuring yourself before comparative data can really help. So what are you going to measure? Obviously GPS, distance is covered, right? That's the physical side. You can start to do parameters on strength and conditioning, speed, agility, quickness. You can start to do things, right? Tactically, you can start to look at things of your own team and habits and percentages in certain areas that you want to look at, whether it's with the ball, without the ball, or transitions, right? Technically, you can start to evaluate your players and start to draw conclusions. That is valuable. But again, I wouldn't be having a separate team to do that if I couldn't really afford that. I'd have my coaches do it. And if you do it for 2 or 3 years, now you got comparative data internally and hopefully externally, where you're playing similar teams, similar age groups, similar format. Now that comparative data can start to give you a lot of enlightening information about players, right? But it's going to take time. I just, like, again, I emphasize, Ishan, with, your question was really good, But again, what's the priority? The priority is to get the kids at the right age on the field in the right format, playing as many games as they can.
Yeah. See, the emphasis has been on player development and how it's really essential for us as a country to get these kids and have them playing for several games in a season. But when you look at it, how much of an emphasis, because I know Fateh Hyderabad has tied up with a physical education enterprise in the UK. How much emphasis do you think that physical education plays, and how these schools around, let's say Hyderabad or even nationwide, actually have an emphasis on physical education? Or even broadly, what do you make of physical education? Because physical education is a term that everyone has a different interpretation of. So yeah.
Well, I mean, that's again a loaded topic. I have a lot of experience with this now because I've been in the ground in schools in India. Okay, so I think there's a few things we have to understand culturally. Okay, whether it's participation in sport or it's physical education, culturally as a country, parents for multiple generations and even largely today, their first concern is for time invested, what is the outcome going to be for my child? Time invested in something, what is the outcome? And largely they're measuring that outcome as admission to a particular academic institution that can make their future career prospects better, a career that has good potential for earnings and growth, right? Those are the two biggest factors when parents in India evaluate how their child is going to spend their time, right? So largely the focus for many generations and still today is academics.
Yeah.
Because that pathway is proven. If you perform well in academia, you're more competitive. You have a good chance to get into a good college, perhaps even abroad, right? And then your career prospects and your income prospects go up, right? And that is largely still the driver. So now, where does physical education fit into that mindset, right? Because I'll give you an example. I have kids, parents who say, hey, he has exams, he can't come to practice. Now, in my generation, I was an honor student. I finished as what would be the equivalent of, I guess, what you call a gold medalist here. I have 2 Ivy League degrees, and I never, ever missed practice for any exam, homework assignment, anything. Not once. Okay? Because for me, participation in sport was a physical activity that I needed, and it was a peer activity with my friends that I needed. And I was disciplined enough that I did my homework. I did well. I studied. I was prepared for my exams. Right? So right there, you see the mindset is, hey, if you're not on the field, you're going to be studying in those hours. And it's going to be better for your academic outcome. But what we actually know is, first of all, we know that the brain works better in 90-minute blocks, largely maximum. And we know that exercise contributes to stimulating intellectual activity in the mind. So again, this is how you look at it. And a lot of kids who don't come to practice because they say they have exams, they're not spending all those hours on studying. Social media, gaming, right? It's a fact. So the first thing I think is to give an answer to you is, where does physical education fit in? I think the first part is understanding that in terms of physical health and mental health and academic outcomes, physical education doesn't take away from it. It adds to it, and it will improve academic performance. The challenge is this mindset that if my kid is participating in a sport, what are his chances or her chances of becoming a professional? That's the wrong mindset to me. The first mindset is participation in sporting activity, whether it's individual or team activity, can have a lot of benefits physically, mentally, emotionally, and intellectually. That's the first part is, do you believe that that's important? Then you're going to value the time spent. And then the people who are delivering it, the teachers and the schools who are responsible for the curriculums and answering to, and whatever government bodies are deciding on physical education policy, once we accept that as a fact, then I think you're going to see the importance of physical education be brought more to light rather than what it is now, which is, hey, you know, after you get a job and you start working, going to the gym will become a part of your life in some way, or yoga, or whatever physical thing that you make a part of your life in the adult phase is important. But what we know is it's as important, if not more important, that it becomes a part of your life in the youth and childhood phase. So hopefully that cultural shift can happen, and it'll take time.
When we look at physical education, do you think, because many associated with, let's say, playing football with your friends, or many associated with just going out and playing basketball for some time, do you associate it with those sports? Do you associate is brought about in attributing aspects such as teamwork, team cohesion, and different aspects that?
Well, yeah, look, there's physical literacy, right? So, you know, the basics of athletic movement, right? Can you run? Can you stop, start, change direction, balancing, jumping? And then you have sports specific fundamental skills of sport, you know, catching, throwing, you know, sending, receiving, we call hitting something, right? Striking it, as we say, could be with different parts of the body, right? You have coordination and agility, right? How coordinated are you, and how agile are you? How fast can you execute that coordination? Balance, you know, are you comfortable balanced from a more sedimentary position and then a more mobile position? So there's physical literacy, and of course then there's individual sports, and sports are a great way to develop that physical literacy, right? Because in the act of playing and participating in the activity, your body's going to be asked to do a lot of these movements. And then, of course, when you train at higher levels of athletics or even lower levels, you'll see people drilling on those specific movements to improve speed and quickness and agility and balance and strength and power. So they're all related, but the point is not everyone wants to participate in football or cricket. Some kids, you know, sports isn't, maybe they just want to go walking, which is perfectly fine. You know, maybe they want to do an individual sport. They're more drawn to that inner time of tennis or golf or badminton. You know, so they're equally important. And I think what's probably come to my feeling is you know, physical education in schools getting more out of the time they have with the kids. I think a lot of physical education programs I've seen, the 40 minutes or 1 hour, 2 or 3 times a week, which is inadequate really, just in terms of exercise, and I'll get to that in a second, but just that time period isn't being utilized to its highest standard possible. And I think that goes back to, again, how society values it. But going back to the exercise regimen, you know, I know the UK has mandated 1 hour of exercise a day. I think you know, or 2 hours a day, I forget what it is, but the school being responsible for half of it and the parents being responsible for the other half. And that mandate is actually less than what used to be when, you know, in the 70s when kids were out playing in the neighborhood more, and you didn't have the sort of gamification and you know, increased academic time that's taken time away from what used to be playing outside in the neighborhood. So now you see, to go back to link it to your question, physical education has an even bigger role to play. If you look at urban India, you look at lack of playing space, you look at outdoor pollution, you look at the academic demands on the child, you look at family demands on the child and social demands. Sports is not as high a priority for a lot of kids. A lot of kids don't have that access. So physical education in schools and participation in sport, to me, is going to take increasingly more importance over time. And I hope that as a society we start valuing it more and more.
Do you think that physical education as a tool can be, let's say, played around with through the government or through government policies? Do you think it's right for the government is this is what we expect, and that should be how you enroll physical education in your schools? That that the kids have to have 60 minutes of exercise every day. Do you think that's correct by the
I
government,
do.
or do you think that the government should leave that to the professionals of physical education?
Well, you could say the same thing about academics. There's a lot of people who've started homeschooling in certain countries because they don't agree with what the government is mandating in academic curriculums. So, that's a controversial thing, I suppose. But I do think government does have to. In India, government plays a huge role in decision making, and I don't think laissez-faire approach will get the results again for the same reasons, because I do think the habit is to believe that more time spent on academics necessarily leads to better performance and better opportunities. So I do think the government should intervene. I do think there should be some kind of mandate, at least as a starting point.
Yep.
Okay, and in a lot of urban pockets, you do see increased child obesity, and you see, I think, what is it, type 2 diabetes is growing in India with children at an alarming rate. So kids aren't, they're eating processed foods, a lot of sugars. Kids have expendable income, and they use it on candy and stuff that they shouldn't be eating probably. And then you have the sedimentary lifestyle. They're sitting in chairs playing video games or on their phone on social media and not necessarily as active. So I think that it has crossed up to a point where some government policy initiative may be necessary. I'm not a fan of government intervening in anything personally, except maybe law and order. But, that's not a great approach for most societies. And in India, I think we're one that really needs government intervention on this.
Listen, Yogi, so it was a pleasure speaking to you. I just before you go, I just said that it was a broke down misconception about, let's say, my how youth development is playing out in the country, whereas what you're actually telling of the actuality of things. Just before you go, anything you'd like to plug, but feel free.
No. Thank you for having me on the show, Ishan. You asked excellent questions. I wish you all the best in your endeavors. The only thing I'd say is what I tell people about, and I'm going to say Indian football, though it can apply to other industries, is pay attention to what is the practical reality on the ground when you formulate opinion or have to take decisions. Be practical and really understand what the practical implications are of your decisions. And then I think that the academics have a really good place and a lot to offer when that prism is understood. So keep it up, and good luck with the show. And really, thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, cheers.
Right, see you then.
Cheers.
Bye.
Yep. Bye.